Our next speaker will be Dr. Bradley Walter. Bradley is the president of Windy Hill Insights, LLC, a company engaged in consulting businesses and systems within meat animal production. Bradley's recently been the past president and CEO of Mashaw Family Foods. While at the Mashaw for over 20 years, he worked throughout the business to support the exponential growth of its operation. He attended the University of Illinois as well, and majoring in animal science. His graduate research program includes the study of nutrition, genetics, and housing as well in commercial production. Bradley and his wife Kimberly, along with their children Lauren and Blake, own and operate Windy Hill Meadows, LLC, a Midwest-based beef operation producing over 600 head per year, selling registered Angus, breeding stock to beef producers, and quality beef as direct sales to consumers. Join me in welcoming Dr. Bradley Walter as he discusses bioeconomic considerations for sustaining the breeding herd within the pork production systems.
Just take a minute to mic up here. All right. Well, Dr. Knox, we've had quite a presence here at Iowa State University today from Illinois, huh? So you guys feel invaded? Well, it's a true honor. Thank you to the program committee for inviting me. Am I coming through okay? No?
There you go.
There we go. How's that? A little better? Never had a problem. At least my wife's never claimed that I couldn't project my voice. So, all right. Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you and to the program committee for the invitation. And Dr. Greiner, we really didn't coordinate our thoughts around sustainability, but the lens that I prepared these remarks today is really around that. And obviously, very inspiring to be here with all of you today. And the future of the pig industry, in my opinion, is bright, largely because of the talent base that supports it. And so the real question in my mind is how do we sustain the industry where we're at? And of course, I have a little bit of a bias, not only around the world, but here in the U.S. How do we sustain that industry? And today, I hope my remarks are focused on finding balance in that sustainability. The very definition itself is fairly broad in my experience. And really, for me, sustainability is about finding that point of balance. And so a little bit of my background in terms of the lens that I bring these remarks to you from. I grew up in southern Illinois. I grew up on a diversified grain and livestock farm, pasture sows. We're coming back, so back to the future for me. We're bringing the industry back to where it was in terms of management style and approach when I was a kid. So small operation. Went to the University of Illinois, as was commented, and had the good fortune. In fact, Dr. Knox and I were talking about the Mormon swine farm where I spent 3 years, 500 Duroc sows there, sort of the formidable years of learning about pig production, and then most recently, a little over 20 years at the Mashaws, and that family and the business, of course, near and dear to my heart. I remain engaged with the Mashaws going forward, but it's this background, this passion for the industry and my set of experiences. I've always been at the applied end. That's really a passion for me. How do we sustain what it is that we do? How do we scale? How do we become more effective and ultimately more efficient with the resources that we've got within our industry? And it'll be that framework that I comment today. As was mentioned, I'm evolving, sort of changing species here, looking for a bit of a new challenge. My wife grew up with a beef background. We've got children, that was commented, and so I'm now sort of dove off into another species and looking at beef today and growing a beef enterprise. And the point I want to make with this slide is that for me, our focus, when we think about sustainability and sustainment of any industry, it really begins with the end in mind. And so my comments today, from my perspective, I think one of the opportunities we have in the pork industry, from my background, is to really focus and ask ourselves, what is the experience that we're providing our consumer? What is it that they're looking for? What experience, and how do we enhance that? How do we ultimately, from a financial point of view, create more total value for that eating experience? And then reverse engineer the system back to the sow, the topic today, and be sure that we're delivering on that brand promise, if you will, in terms of what we do. And of course, I suspect there's a lot of unit managers and a lot of caregivers in the audience today, and ultimately, it's at that level that really counts. And so the point of this slide is to say that's how I think about, and the comments I make today with respect to the sow is about what is the ultimate eating experience we want to deliver, what's that brand promise, how do we leverage the biological know-how. Dr. Knox brought a tremendous set of reproductive comments, and it reminds me of how advanced we've become in terms of the science behind the technology, the opportunities that are in front of us. But the real goal I have today with this conversation with all of you is to ask and challenge us, how do we find the point of balance within the system? And again, this is using beef cattle as the model, and find that point of balance every day as we deliver it to a production system. And of course, I'm just cutting my teeth on the beef side, but the challenges are the same. And to that point, I think the real challenge we've got among food animal production today is this little nemesis of our breeding females. I question, have we found that point of balance in terms of how we manage that animal? Because there's certainly strong signaling that we've got some real challenges in front of us in our ability to retain her in our breeding herds. And so obviously this is pig data that we're all familiar with, and MetaFarms analysis looking at over a decade that shows we've got an increasing rate of sow mortality in our farms. We're all intimately familiar with that. And again, it's not unique to us. I think if you look at the dairy industry, again, an industry that has a good set of data, it's maybe not at the same rate, but the point of inflection is moving in the same direction. And so it begs questions as we intensify our livestock production systems. Are we finding that point of balance in terms of management that's retaining that breeding female, the core of the sustainment of our business? And so I think we need to think more broadly perhaps and say, how can we be in this together as we think about our breeding females, and how do we learn from other species, and certainly see the problem statement potentially the same. At the core of the issue, from my perspective, is it's, I think, one of the greatest risks. And look, guys, I've spent the last 20 years thinking about risk to a Midwest pig production enterprise, and we tend to talk about risk in terms of financial risk. There's ways of offsetting that. We've got all sorts of options and of offsetting financial risk. This is a real biological risk that I think poses one of the greatest challenges to sustaining meat animal production in general, and certainly the leader in pork production from my perspective. So don't want to blow it too far out of proportion, but I think it's a real challenge for us. And again, just tremendously honored to give you my thoughts around it. The core of the question was, what is the economics of, this particular issue in pig production? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I really want to applaud that Iowa State's taken the lead on, a tool from a financial point of view, and we think about it maybe more tangibly in terms of cost of production. But I really want to propose, again, as we think about risk, trying to quantify what I'm suggesting there, is I think, again, it comes up to this consumer experience. And I think for me, in the commodity industries in general in agriculture, that consumer experience is all too often not looked at, lost on us in terms of how we design, operate, and manage our industry. And for me, it starts there. And I think we just have to recognize the antagonism that could exist if we were to share with our consumers that in some cases 1 in 5 of our sows won't see the new year. And so I think it's a real challenge, and it's intangible. I can't quantitate it for you today, but I think we would all tend to agree that's a big challenge and has potentially harming significant consequences for the industry. I think it's also a challenge in the caregiver profession. Again, you probably sense from my comments, I'm wildly passionate about the talent base in this industry and seeing the talent base evolve and develop. But I question, especially my young children that are involved in agriculture, I think about the psychological impact of loss. We see it every day on our farm, no different than pigs. Cattle have similar challenges. And I think about the psychological impact, and I fear for their interest in remaining committed and exploring that as a profession. At this point, they have, but again, these young people are spoiled for choice. And so I think, again, an intangible, I can't quantify what that is, but certainly I can tell you, with 30 years of experience in pig production, it's not about the pig, it's about the person, it's about the people. And so I worry and fear for an industry that may not attract the brightest and best if we don't manage some of the real inherent risk involved. The environmental impact, just the sheer impact of loss, and what do we do with those carcasses, and how do we dispose and manage the biosecurity risk of managing mortalities on farm. And ultimately, it's been suggested already, the regulation and the environment. It's really the environment for regulation and political consequences of not being proactive and owning a better outcome for us as an industry. And I think it's really hard to defend regulation if we can't show a continuous improvement within this sector. So I think there's a real case for the topic. Again, very honored to be here and be a part of it. So Peter Drucker, we're all, if you're into management, we're all very familiar with his comments. You can't manage what you don't measure. And the biggest challenge I would have for us as an industry, and I again, remain connected with the mash shop, still very passionate about pig production, as you probably see. And so I put myself in this bucket. I think we've got to step back and say, we'll be what we measure ourselves to be. You guys that are managing farms, you know that. Where you measure and collaborate with your team members daily is where you get a response and improvement. And so my challenge to us is, do we really think about ourselves in a sustainment sort of way? In my experience, again, for my sins, I look back and I reflect and I think about the real risk within our industry is not to optimize the system. We tend too frequently to sub-optimize, and it's a function of our measurement. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think about the needed evolution of our industry, and we think about the evolution we talk too frequently about pigs per mated sow per year. We started in the last couple of decades thinking about pigs per sow lifetime. And I think what we really have to evolve to, again, is what is it that our consumers are looking for. I'll use the plug grade A today, certainly other definitions. I think we should wrestle with this, but we really need to take a look at what it is that our real outcome is, that consumer eating experience per sow. Now, again, that's lofty. That's a real lofty vision and suggestion relative to those of you that are managing sow farms. But again, I think it's on us to evolve past where we are, manage the risk that's in front of us, and create a sustainable environment for our industry. And I think we have to think that broadly and start to really evolve our measurement systems, because we'll be what we measure ourselves to be. And history certainly demonstrated that. And by the way, we have a tremendous amount of success. Dr. Knox just showed us what's happened in terms of PSY. And we all know that if you've been around the industry as long as I have, we've got a wild success. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of measurement and sub-optimization. My case for this is simply to look at animals in the wild, right? We've got no financial investment there, right? It's just a biological outcome that matters, survival. And as we evolve pigs, let me go back. As we evolve pigs from the wild, we've invested behind them, right? And the investment rate continues to go up for the industry. We've invested in their housing. We'll have nutritionists on the programs that we'll learn from today. We invest in caregivers, genetic merit, variety of systems that have allowed that I'll call it suboptimal output, pigs per sow per year, to go up. And in fact, the investment is to a point that I would never have dreamt. It was well under half that when I started out in this industry. But, we're at, well over 10,000 investment per female place in these systems today, without question. If we were to think about building a new system today, it's going to take at least that and arguably more. And so as we do that, of course, the challenge of return on that investment, which is the responsible thing we've got to look at, it becomes a real challenge to balance these financial, biological inputs and to find that point of balance and find optimum as a system. And far too often, our management and measurement systems get us to suboptimal, and there's consequences of that. And so how do we improve? I think one of the challenges we've got as an industry is how do we create a more dynamic measurement system that looks at it in total? And of course, we've evolved, by the way. I'm being sort of hard on us. I'm being critical myself, again, as an industry participant. But how it is that we've evolved. We are evolving, but how can we accelerate that evolution? How can we develop better communication systems? That's one of the biggest learnings I had as we scaled the system at the MASH office, is just fundamentally getting back in touch and enhancing communications within farms, within sow farms, and bringing financial data as well as downstream growing pig data back to that sow farm so they can be, more inclusive, more total systems thinking, not sub-optimizing, looking at just the wean pigs that are leaving the door. It's tough. I'm not suggesting this is easy, just suggesting it's a way that I think we've got to challenge ourselves to think. It's a modality for us to invest behind and challenge us, within each of the farms that are represented here today to think differently. And so there's a reason. The point of the slide is to say there is a reason we look the way we do. With that said, we've got the challenge of finding the point of balance as we work forward. Again, I applaud tremendous effort. We're talking about bioeconomics, so the biology and economics. Tremendous effort, and I applaud the work that's been done at Iowa State University. Certainly much more capable and provides, the economics of what a sow loss is. And my argument would be that it's very relevant. It's within, one of the top things that management can focus on. These are, again, the tangible economics captured in terms of both inputs and the revenue drivers of a sow farm. So this is available, and I just want to say thank you to Iowa State. I think tremendous leadership, great piece of work here by Dr. Schultz. With that said, I'm going to challenge us again in the spirit of the discussion. Let's take a look at those revenue lines and how do we enhance them. It's very complicated, very difficult, even within large integrated systems. In fact, I found it to be even more challenging, perhaps, in large, all-company-owned systems to get the measurement systems and dynamic communication channels aligned back to communicate to this sort of systems-based outcome. And so it's a real challenge. But from that point, I'm going to challenge us to even, here we're measuring, again, a wean pig. Consumer doesn't eat a wean pig. Wean to finish systems we grow a wean pig, but that's not what we sell. And so if you start there, we'll talk about that in just a second. I just want to plug that I think this is even a more relevant topic as we look at inflationary pressures on our fixed cost system. Good news, feed cost is coming down. But overall, when you look at the general fixed and variable costs of labor, it remains a very, very important topic. So back to, I want to share some data. So I'm challenging, again, how we think about and measure systems. So, building off of what is a tremendous model that helps us understand the economics of sow loss. But if we shift our paradigm a little bit to what is a wean pig worth, and we look at, this is a data that I generated with a research team at the MASH office, about 15 years old, actually. But I think the concept still applies. This is taking a look at progeny from gilt litters versus sow litters. The key thing I want to point out is substantial improvement in growth and mortality rate. So we would have said at the time this was about a $3.40, 50-cent improvement in outcome per market pig. Okay, and the point I want to make here is shifting. When you start thinking about losing 1 in every 5 sows on our farms today, think about the number of gilt pigs that are being produced versus sow pigs. And again, there's veterinarians and epidemiologists in the audience today that I think would grant me, support me with the notion if we could have fewer gilt pigs in populations, we would have better outcomes from a health and performance point of view. And so again, we start to really challenge, I think, what is a wean pig worth, and then take it the next level beyond. This is looking at just the growing components, but what if we took it all the way into the plant and we measured carcass outcomes on sows versus gilt pigs? I don't have that data, but one would expect at least fewer health challenges, that there would be difference, and again, probably measured in dollars, not cents. And so we have a long way to go with this whole notion of measuring more holistically and communicating across various sectors. But I would challenge us that one of the real things I think that are preventing our improvement in sow loss or breeding animal loss is sub-optimization, our measurement systems and how we think about the business today. And to that point, Kuketsu put forward the notion of pigs per sow per lifetime annualized. And I think it's a really good construct, a good way to think about our business. Again, I sort of inject grade A pounds. And the key takeaway is that how do we get balance? Again, that's just looking at the sow farm. But if you start to think about the pig outcomes in terms of a system, you start to realize, well, what is the proper productivity rate? How many pigs per litter? Dr. Knox also sort of suggests what is optimum. And again, the real reality is if you're looking at it from a system level, that optimum is going to be different relative to that system's objective or outcome. And so it's about productivity, it's about reproductive rate, and to a lesser extent today we look at our ability to keep her and the time in the herd. But it's about finding that point of balance among those three. And again, I would suggest it's probably going to be different by system. And so taking these measurements and applying economics and taking a look at grade A, I'll call it grade A as a plug. I think it needs to be defined system specific. But how do we take this sort of approach and build measurement systems and more importantly communication, particularly in large systems, from leadership all the way through the system, and making sure that we're finding that point of balance. And again, it's sort of a lofty goal, but I think just moving in that direction, challenging ourselves to think in that way, will allow us to improve our outcomes as a system. And I think overly simplifying and bringing this from, whether you're a researcher in this audience and thinking about what area you might work in, or if you're on-farm manager or pig caregiver every given day in a sow farm, I'm going to suggest that there's sort of too overly simplified a model to accept. And one is just, am I optimizing the environment for that sow in a given day? And one of the real challenges I see for the U.S. industry and arguably the global industry is you look at historical returns in this industry, and this is really small. I just want to, the real takeaway is I've looked at these returns over the course of my career, the past 20 years, and returns to hog facilities have exceeded farmland, S&P 500. Now, that's recently changed, right? We've probably got plenty of assets within the U.S. industry for our demand equation at the moment. And so the real reality is we've got financial challenges ahead of us in terms of our investment thesis. And so when we think about investing behind the optimal environment for that sow, it's not likely, in my opinion, to be a lot of new facilities. And so I think, again, whether you're a researcher or you're a caregiver, you've been given that asset to manage, we've got to start to think really creative about how do we evolve the assets and the infrastructure that we have today and make it work for us in a more holistic sense. And so we all know the opportunities to construct new facilities and the housing systems. But again, I'm going to put forward that I think, particularly for the researchers in the audience, the challenge you've got to help us as an industry is think about working within the asset infrastructure and how do we retrofit. And it's been talked about in terms of pen, but it's flooring. It's actually gating. These are things we've not looked at in a long time in our industry. And again, I debated putting the reasons for losses, but I suspect everybody in this audience knows the primary drivers of losses in sow farms today. And I think in all of these situations, whether it's health and biosecurity, protecting the farm, nutrition, we've got a really awesome panel of speakers I'm looking forward to as we work through the day. But managing this female as a system under the economic realities that we're not likely, at least in the next decade, to see a lot of new infrastructure, perhaps some replacement, but in large part we're going to be working with the physical assets we have. How do we optimize those? I think it's a real challenge if you're a researcher in the audience today. And of course, the again, oversimplified, optimizing the environment for the sow, and the inverse of that is optimizing the sow for our environment. So if you buy what I'm selling, we've sort of got the fixed asset base that we're working forward with. How do we ensure that our animals fit well into that environment? I'm using an illustration, not necessarily plug in AccuFast, but at the Mash-Offs while I was there, we had a proprietary set of genetic lines, and AccuFast acquired them, as you know. And the key point I want everyone to take away is that we really measured, and still do for for AccuFast today as a system, we really measure the animals in our environment. So we're looking for biological outcomes inside of the environment where the animals are managed. And for a long time, being trained inside of a geneticist lab, we think about how do we remove the environmental factors to allow for gene expression, and we're trying to pick the high flyers from that, in terms of genetic nucleuses, and we always want to see gene expression in a perfect environment. And I think challenging that a little bit, I think there's a role for that, but I think we've also got to do a better job of measuring gene expression in the realities of our environment and finding those animals. And so all of the genetic companies were blessed with, in my opinion, with a tremendous set of resources in terms of genetic improvement in the world, and that shift is being made. But how do we accelerate that shift? How do we invest in measurement? Again, the argument I'm making today is in our rethinking our measurement systems, rethinking what we measure, and rethinking about the value of what we measure in a more holistic way to support sustainment of our industry. So final set of thoughts in terms of summarizing what I hope to convey with these thoughts. I think what areas can we work on? What can we collaborate? How do we bring and garner investment to work on some of these things? For me, again, inspired by the people in this audience, and in my 30 years in the industry, I'm just encouraged that the talent base that we're bringing to the industry really has me very, very bullish for its future. But I think we have to invest very purposefully in team member development. It's one of the key beliefs I have, and I think it all starts, again, if you buy what I'm selling, we're measuring things in a more holistic way. What's implied there is we have the competency and skill set within our human capability, within our talent base. And so that doesn't come without continued investment. Again, I applaud Iowa State for leading the industry, encouraging education development, and today is obviously one of those. Integrating information systems, again, that's been the real argument I've tried to make this morning, is how do we evolve our information? It's really difficult in economic circumstances like we find ourselves today. With that said, we have to persevere. I think that very thing that we're reluctant probably to invest in because it's not sort of biting us in the tail today is the very thing that I think is limiting our potential for success and profitability within times like these. So it's really difficult to have the fortitude to continue to invest behind things like information systems. And then deliberate communications. Most of us in this industry, myself certainly, in a position one here, we came up as animal caregivers. We've got a fondness for animals. The people thing isn't necessarily always our game. And so we probably communicate better with animals than we do people. And so how can we help build communication systems, prioritize that, and again, I'm using measurement systems as one proxy for other things that need to be communicated. Systems get larger, they get more complex. Is everybody following us with the recognition of what our desired outcome is, what our goal and objective of the system? Seems so simple, but I'll tell you, as you peel that onion back and get into it, it becomes one of the greater challenges, I think, in the pig industry today as we've scaled. This is a piece, again, that I feel very strongly about. Our strategy for indexing our facilities, monitoring the capability. It's going to be very, very tempting after an extended period of equity loss in this industry. It's going to be very challenging to convince ourselves to continue to invest in the assets and infrastructure. And I think it all starts with an objective measurement of where they're at. I've had more calls in the last month from leaders in the industry that are really wrestling with how do you think about obsolescence, Bradley? How do you monitor? And I think that's one of the things we did over the last decade at the Mash-Offs, really monitor obsolescence from an objective measurement point of view. and have plans for that obsolescence. Have plans either to reinvest and mitigate the obsolescence or retire and sunset the asset, but be very purposeful and very intended. I think it's a really, really important part of our industry and inside of what I'm talking about today. Finally, again, I'm a scientist at heart, passion for pigs, but scientist at heart. As if I've used the word measurement once, I've probably said it 100 times this morning. And so I'm trained as a scientist, and I think, as with most things, science offers us the potential to find the answers. And I think we just have to continue to challenge our scientific community, create an environment in our university systems, look at applied public and private partnerships under this construct of systems-based. And we tend to get, I think, oftentimes, because, again, we're rewarded, to look at very myopic and small components without taking a look at where does it fit in the broader industry and the broader concept of providing pork as an eating experience to a consumer and having real positive outcomes as a result of that experience. Finally, genetic improvement, I've already put in a positive plug. That's one of the areas that technically has always interested me, and I'm just really, really encouraged. I see a lot of things happening at an increasing rate in terms of genetic science. The investment behind genetic improvement in this industry is wildly exciting. It's very encouraging to think about where this animal will be within the next decade, and I think we just have to be sure that we're actually building the animal for our environment, not an animal independent of our environment. I think that's one of the real risks in the construct I'm putting forward today. And then finally, because one of my favorite veterinarians is sitting in the front row, I've got to put a plug in for Dr. Paul. We still need his help. He's been promising things to me for over 2 decades now, and he sometimes overpromises and underdelivers in terms of health management and health monitoring. Of course, he's truly one of my favorites, and that's not the case for Paul. But I think this is one of our real challenges, again, sort of systems-based thinking and collaboration. I think there's more and more collaboration between the historical animal science and veterinary community than there ever has been. But I'm encouraged about where that leads. So with that, I'll end and just say this is what we're looking for, that happy sow that provides a happy consumer eating experience. It's a complicated path as to how we get there, but I think more than ever we'll achieve that. And with that, I'll take questions, and I hope I've allowed enough time.
We have more than enough time, so feel free to ask questions, or if you had some more for Dr. Knox as well, we've got sufficient time here before break. Any questions? We talked a lot about cost, and maybe I'll ask for joint comments from the room. What is our today cost of a replacement gilt, getting her to the crate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, it's going to differ by system. But I think, I haven't done the work to say, hey, here's what the industry cost is. But I think those systems that are really sophisticated and looking at, again, investment in genetics all the way through applying the latest and that we're aware of in terms of science. And if you've gone ahead and made the asset investment to support gilt development, so apply the science and gilt development, it's sizable. It's, I think, well in excess of $500 a gilt. That's, my more recent experience.
Sure. Yep. Fixed, variable cost, both. Crawling up. Dr. Yiska.
So with your genetics background, when we look at the improvement over time, and we also say we don't want as many gilts in the herd, so where's that balance? And maybe speak a little bit to retention as well as mortality and some of those issues to help us get that right balance.
Yeah. So I think, and make sure, Paul, I'm framing this relative to your question, but Dr. Yeski's asked me the question of, with my genetic lenses, where is the point of balance? We think about gilt retention, trying to retain the sows, what's the proper balance? And I don't know, a simple answer is to sort of throw a replacement rate number out there. You probably remember I really challenged our system probably a decade ago to run at a 40% replacement. And we, in actual fact, in certain farms, did that, very successfully. But things have evolved for us. On the average in our system, we're running about 55 to 60. I still think we have to challenge ourselves to get lower than that. And one of the significant capital investments we made in a component of our system is to actually try and apply the latest scientific evidence for gilt development. And, sizable investments where we get to larger than 500 sort of number on gilts entering. It's been successful. It's very early stages. We're about 3 years into that. And of course, it involves a lot of health acclimation strategy. You, of course, helped us set up. I'm very encouraged. I would say for anybody that is looking to get the genetic potential, we'll come back to sort of the genetic aspect of the question in a second, but to harvest that genetic potential, I think gilts entering sow herds have been an afterthought for far too long. We've been talking a lot about it, so it's starting to shape thoughts, but we enter a gilt, give her 8 weeks to get acclimated and have a rod inside of her short time thereafter and wonder why, we go through so many of them. And oh, by the way, we tend to go check on them before we leave for the day. And, from my perspective, we have to shift that paradigm. We have to start there. And so we've tried to do that on about 60,000 sows of the business. And I would tell you it was an initial high cost of, anybody that's looking to do that, and probably some of you have and are probably further along than what we are. But I would just tell you, you'll have a shockingly high cost initially because there's a learning curve to adapting and putting all those scientific principles in place. But again, Paul, I think wrapping it all the way back to genetics, what I think I've learned in those sort of 3 years of adoption, again, I don't know, I'm not aware, where from a genetics perspective, we've really gone about measuring those things and trying to select for traits within that gilt development system that allows us to set her up for success. And again, she's been an afterthought. So I think we'll get there. Again, I've already applauded and sound like a cheerleader. I don't intend to be. I'm just really impressed with where genetic science is moving at a faster pace than ever. And I think the more we apply it in a practical construct, the more evidence that will more progress we'll make. So I think somewhere in that range, system dependent, is where we land today. Great question. Yep.
So Bradley, you talked about system optimization versus sub-optimization and moving towards that pounds of grade A pork sold per breeding female. So how do you implement that into a farm, right? Did you guys have any experience with that? Did you do any incentives? How do you combine the information? And like anything like you mentioned, right, that what gets measured gets better. What was your guys' experience with trying to move the system along to utilize that as the all unifying number to go by that everybody looked at?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So Dr. Rodemaker's asked, what's been our experience as a system with this notion of expanding our breadth of measuring things as a comprehensive system, measuring our things towards grade A pounds per sow. So we started that metric, I will tell you that, and we're probably not the only ones with it. But for years we've looked at grade A pounds per sow. That's and I think, it does really start there practically and that is the challenge and that you've asked. I think one of the things that has been, and I think still remains a challenge is in larger systems and the more you measure, the more data you create and the higher propensity to go under the watermark, drowning in that data. And so for us, there's been a lot of focus in information management systems. That's one thing you cannot overlook as you think about scaling, livestock production. And I think it's still a big nemesis towards it. So again, part of what I thought I'd try and do today is build, some reasons to collaborate, some reasons to think perhaps differently. And so for us, the first hurdle, Chris, is really in that information systems. Now we've overcome it to a degree. We've tried to go to information management providers. One of the real challenges is who's investing in a way that's sustainable, that you can rely will still be there in 5 years. And we've had, frankly, mixed experiences as we've invested in information platforms. And I think it's one of the key hurdles we've got that I think, again, requires the industry to sort of come together because, current economic conditions is not going to incent significant information system investment. So how do we've got to be, I think, very purposeful, very conscious. So that's the number one hurdle. But you've got to prioritize it. And so that is a big investment to start at collecting the data, getting it reported back to farms. There's the competency build of what it is that they're looking at. For years, I think we've done a pretty good job taking a look at biological outcomes. But boy, the last decade, I've probably spent as much time trying to bring financial or bioeconomic outcomes back to that discussion. And, for those of us that are trained in animal science, you almost got slapped for crossing the road to Mumford Hall, Dr. Knox, where the ag economists live. And so, that is a big journey for us. So that would be another hurdle, and we had to consciously, but I'm very proud of where, the MASH-off system is. I think if you talk to unit managers and they're seeing that data today. So that's sort of step two. First is build the information systems, reporting channels. You probably sense from this presentation, I think one of the challenges the system has, you can get really lofty, and I think you should, but you always have to come back to where do we start? Where do you take a bite? And I think just incremental, the real essence of continuous improvement. I think that, the thing I find myself saying all the time, that the enemy of, the enemy of best is better. And, we just need to get better every day. And so I think that's how you go about it. And again, I think if you're, whether you're in an integrated, so ownership out to the meat, out to that consumer experience, or you're not, I think that's got to be our challenge from a production. Start to think about that. We tend to think about our animals, where that pig leaves the door of our center, whether that's in a farrowing unit or a wean to market unit, nursery, whatever it may be. That's our deliverable. And I think we have to, that's part of my argument this morning, we have to look at our deliverable doesn't end there, that we're just a link inside of a broader supply chain. And look, we've got a challenge. Our supply chain has not moved the needle on demand. And I think it starts with us.
One last question. Tammy, did you have one?
So, I'm an engineer. We're working on a lot of different things. Where do you think where should we focus in the sow area? What piece of technology would have the most bang for our buck for producers?
That is a big question.
So the question was, from a technology standpoint, what's coming at us in the breeding herd? What's the one, maybe?
So I'm biased. I'm biased by passion here more than I am by data or cognitive thinking. I think we've spent an inordinate amount of emphasis in our farrowing centers, in our farrowing houses. We do a pretty good job, in my opinion, of what we've historically called day one care, our ability to, wean live-born pigs from sows. And there's still tremendous opportunity. There's a lot of loss. But I'm seeing investment. I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing. We have a bias there. We do a pretty good job. I'm going to bring us back to Dr. Yeski's question. I think it's, there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity. I think about this, the problem statement back, that breeding female slide, and the fact that we're losing them. And I think, we've got to get beyond, it starts actually when we're conceiving that guilt, but really as we're growing, developing, and acclimating her. So I think measurement systems in that, and there's just sensors. I mean, the world of technology is way beyond the scope of my capability to keep up with it these days. But I really think we've got to be monitoring. As I think about your question, I'm drawn to how do we get beyond ignoring, that female until we need her. And I think, bringing that attention back there and really investing in her is the biggest part of the solution here to the problem statement.
Very good. Join me in thanking Dr. Walter here this morning.